everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and we're going to discuss on impact investment. We will discuss on environmental investment, and we have our world famous speakers, uh, Professor David Smith, Professor David J. Kelly, as well as we have our famous entrepreneur, Mr. Arno, Mr. Marshalls, and Mr. Mark Sabin. So I want to give chance, Mr. Marshall. Before that, we have our expert panelist because I know that he is doing excellent work with his AGI lab. Especially, they are focusing more focus on policy development, which is very very important for impact investment. Even example, Mr. Marshall, if you want to do projects in Malaysia, definitely you have to follow the policy and procedures. So hopefully this will be the new things for our global communities. First, I want to give chance Professor David J. Callis. If you want to share some of your experience and some of the example from your lab, because we are very interested because World Talent Economy Forums, we are focused on public-private partnerships. We are working with different countries' Prime Minister Office. We are launching some high-quality conference and collaborations with government. So hopefully you can guide us and you can help us to develop some good strategy. Professor David J. Kelly.
Thanks, Sharif. Do you want to rephrase the question for me?
Yes, very simple. Like example, as you are working in the AGI lab, and what I understand, your AI will be the future that they will develop different policy. So how does it work? How it will be helpful for this practical world? Let's say for this businessman, how they can get benefit from AGI
Yeah.
lab and your things.
So, so the system we've been working on the last several years is it's a collective intelligence system. So it's using a type of AGI cognitive architecture at with a collective system that allows you to collect input from individuals, and then it's able to synthesize thought around policies and do policy analysis, bias detection, and things like that. The applications are primarily in organizational management, in e-governance, in both in a political setting or a governmental setting. So, like right now, we're in talks with a country to implement the system where they're collecting information from the constituents, and then the system actually is synthesizing policy changes in that particular in that country. It's a way for, like in this case, for like a legislator to collect input from their constituents and actually have that system analyze their input, their opinions, and as well as data sources and other things it can pull from over the internet to look at what is the best policy for addressing, problem X or problem Y or whatever that issue happens to be. And that's the primary use case for the kind of collective superintelligent systems that we're working on.
Thank you. Mr. Marshall. So definitely you are working with a very important project, this is really important for the developing world, especially waste management and all of your things. So I want to give you the chance. So what you want to share with our audience.
So thank you, Sharif. In today's session on getting serious on the climate crisis, excuse me, it's a good segue from what David J. Kelly talked about. A lot of the issues that are happening now in blended financing solutions for the developing world, as well as the developed world, are coming about at a rapid pace. One of the biggest issues is the adoption of these new blended financing solutions. And as you well know, the background that we bring to the table is adoption of innovation in different technologies of over 30 years and different types of processes. To give you an example, the classic example is what's happening now with the adoption of vaccines around the world for the pandemic. And we all know that there's a big push now to get rid of the legislative component or the regulatory component of vaccines and allowing them to be developed, let's say in India. India has been a big developer of vaccines. And only now is it beginning to get access to those vaccines without having to worry about the patents. And one of the issues in developing any innovation is quality control, and especially in technologies that spread to practitioners in the medical field. But to give you an example, in our field, in the United States, there's been adoption of what we call ag tech. That's agricultural technology. That ag tech has been around. The protocol for that has been around since the 1980s. And what it really is, it's people do agricultural experiment in what are called stations, U.S. Government stations, federal stations around the United States. And in each of these 50 states, they have these stations located. People develop technology. Then they pass them off to state agricultural extension services to see if they will recommend their adoption. Well, that's a very good way to get technology to farmers, because farmers have a very big problem around the world, whether it's the United States or Malaysia or any place. They are typically on volatile margins. What do I mean by that? From a financial point of view, it could be sink or swim. They could be very wealthy one day and very poor the next because of the crop cycle. And so with the climate crisis, we're starting to see a lot of change occurring, not just in weather patterns, but over amounts of changing of the atmosphere, such as greenhouse gas emissions, which is a big deal. Why is that connected to blended financing? Because one of the things that we found that the United States implemented for back in the 1980s, which is this mechanism to which is called consensus development conferencing. That's what they're doing. COP26, which was the big environmental conference that was held in November of 2021 in Glasgow, that was a conference type situation where they're trying to bring people from disparate areas, finance, technology, science. And scientists, by the way, are very reticent on saying something is good to go until they've done rigorous testing. And that doesn't necessarily lend itself to the situation that we are in today with the climate crisis, where all hands on deck need to be brought to the table, and we need to act rapidly. Otherwise, we will be at a point of no return, climate-wise, health-wise, and there's a prediction that within 5 to 7 years, not our prediction, but a prediction by that came out of COP26, there will be 200 million climate migrants around the world in the next 5 to 7 years. If the United States has a problem of 10,000 children coming from Guatemala across their southern border, or the EU has a problem of 1.2 million migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, Syria, and other places, and even from Turkey into the EU, what's going to happen to the world? What's going to happen to Malaysia? What's going to happen to Indonesia? What's going to happen to India and China when 200 million migrants start getting out of the situation? That's the issue that we're addressing overall. That's the Google Earth view, like a top-down view of what the issue is. So today, what we want to talk about is some practical issues on how to address that problem from a financing point of view. And we've discovered that there is a solution. And we know that as you've talked about, the Malaysian government has its policies. The Indian government has its policies. The Bangladesh has its policies. All these policies are built on what are predicated on a pre-pandemic method and a pre-climate crisis issue, which is fine, but it's like, I'm not going to get a vaccine because there's a COVID crisis. That's kind of not a good idea. We already know that the United States has more than 900,000 deaths, not people with COVID, 900,000 deaths from a zoonotic disease because they didn't get the vaccine in time, or most of those deaths are related to vaccines, not having vaccines, I'm sorry. So it's the same thing here. The climate crisis is actually a bigger wave than the zoonotic disease of COVID. COVID will come and go eventually, but we have bigger issues on our hands. So what I would like to do is go to the next slide, Sharif, and introduce some of the people here. The topics that we're going to address today is the difficulty of funding climate solutions, the complexity and confusion that comes with it, such as and I'll have Mark speak to this, and the developing world opportunities for sovereign entities, such as the government of Malaysia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and African countries. The good news is there are mechanisms that are almost in place to address this problem from a financial point of view, so that sovereigns can kind of maintain their policies and not have to risk the funds that they receive. This is the new innovation, but sometimes it sounds too good to be true. So we're going to address that very question. Why does it seem to be too good to be true? What are the barriers to overcoming the adoption of this kind of financial funding from a policy point of view and from a financial point of view? And what are some of the solutions that are out there if and only if the policies and the governments are willing to adopt and modify their approach? One of the things that we have, one of the people that we have in our team is David Smith, whom you've introduced me to a long time ago. And he is an expert in public-private partnerships. And he's told us in past sessions that public-private partnerships are not easy to do, but they can be successful. And he's brought several examples of that. Before we get to that question, though, we want to go to the next slide. So what here is a graph. It's called a Sankey graph, and that's a type of graph that shows the complexity and confusion of all the issues that have to do with adoption of the technologies that can solve the climate crisis, the policy considerations, etc. Now, this is very hard to read on a graph like on a slide like this, but we can make this available to people if they wish, and they can contact you and we can send it to them. But this came out of a report from the COP26 event on carbon sequestration and how to sequester carbon. This is the so-called map that shows what's going on out there. And I would like to address two things at this point and hand it off first to Mark Sabin and then to Arno. Mark is going to give us some of the issues that are involved with the complexity and confusion. And then Arno is going to show success and how it can be addressed in the practical world. And that's what we want. That's what we need. We need practicality. We need real solutions. And a lot of people are skeptical because, well, has it been done here before? You know, when you invent something new, everybody, the only people that are ready and willing to adopt are people that usually have lots of money, and we're talking about consumer items, and have the wherewithal that they can try it, and if it doesn't work, they throw it away. We're not in that position with this type of approach for the adoption of the climate crisis solutions. So I'd like to go to the next slide. So one of the things, and this it tees up Mark to come in on board, we have over 100 trillion, if you can go down a little bit, we have over 100 trillion in committed funds from private investment moving into carbon removal technology. That's a big deal. I don't think the government of Malaysia or even of India has 100 trillion available to itself. So one of the things that we know is that it's time to garner that 100 trillion and through this network called GFANS and allocate it to the countries so that the money can be there as a backstop and not have to act on the economies of each country. So I'd like to hand off Mark to kind of go through some of the issues that we're addressing today. Go ahead, Mark.
Great. Thank you, Marshall. So when we're talking about what these solutions are, there are kind of two areas that we have to consider where the problems lie. One is that the solutions themselves are pretty complex, and there are many different types of solutions that can be used. So there are natural solutions such as planting trees and doing things that are using natural resources to be able to try to mitigate climate change. Those tend to be short-lived and don't necessarily do the kind of extraction process that we're talking about. Another one, and one of the ones that is really at the heart of what we're trying to accomplish here, is the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. So there's a lot of talk about carbon neutral, about getting to carbon zero, but we actually have to begin to extract the carbon from the atmosphere because there's residual carbon that has been put in over the last several hundred years of the Industrial Revolution, where we've been burning massive amounts of fossil fuels, we've been burning wood, some of these things obviously from natural disasters, but much of it from the industrialization, particularly of the developed world. And the consequences of that, of course, are being felt more acutely in the developing world. So what we're seeing is that there's still an inequity that actually has to be addressed. So one of the complexities that we're talking about, and that these solutions, by bringing this kind of investment opportunity into the world, is to be able to see what can we do to bring the type of financial instruments into this, both the developed world and the developing world, that can actually begin to bring these innovations to the market. And if you want to go to the next slide, Sharif, we'll see that what we're looking at is that we're trying, this is the fundamental issue, is to try to build a bridge across the funding chasm. So traditionally, investment has been dominated by things like fossil fuels and the opportunities that are being developed in technology and in the Western world, the developing world of Europe and the United States in particular. But now, with the advent of what's happening with COP26, what's happening with the new impulse and desire to begin to actually address climate change, which is an imminent and existential threat to the world, we actually want to be able to develop methods for bringing the funding across the chasm. What's called the chasm. And if you look at this diagram, what you see is that essentially we're looking at a bridge that's being built, and the bridge is using an archway. And what's been happening is that in each of those different bricks are some type of financial instrument, some sort of financial tool that's traditionally been used. But in order to be able to support the bridge and to keep the arch in place, it actually needs a keystone. That actually is going to enable all of these funding opportunities to be presented globally. And that keystone, which has only been developed in the last year and a half, really, is called the pre-issuance credit enhancement model. And that model is being used specifically to be able to allow the climate bond funding to be supported by things like sovereign banks, where they're not having to necessarily put their money into the investment structure, but are actually guaranteeing the credit and backing the credit of the innovative companies that are bringing solutions and that need to be able to have the financial mechanisms to be able to become operational. So by putting these pre-issuance credit enhancements, that allows organizations such as sovereign banks or private equity or some of the newer economic equity models that are being built to involve revolving trusts, where they put a certain amount of funds to be set aside, and in maintaining them in their own financial institutions. So if it's a sovereign bank, in that bank is being offered as a credit enhancement to an organization to be able to support the implementation of a climate bond. Those climate bonds are a very particular type of investment that have a great deal of importance for the investment community because they're being monitored by the Climate Bond Initiative, which is making certain that they are meeting the standards necessary and the requirements necessary to actually address the climate crisis and actually be able to create that bridge that we can cross the funding chasm and actually begin to solve the climate problem altogether. So there are many, many innovations. There are a lot of technologies that are being developed by entrepreneurs that have the opportunity to actually address these issues, but many of them don't have the financial mechanisms to be able to be funded. Now, there are a whole variety. If we go to the next slide, we can see that that we have these different types of carbon removal technologies that are available to us. And as we go through them, one of the things that we see is that we have things like I was saying about natural solutions like reforestation. There are things that are done with carbon that can be sequestered into the soil through biochar. There are a lot of bioenergy opportunities that are being presented. And now some of the more expensive types of solutions that are technology-based are things like direct air capture or weather enhancing technologies that can actually be deployed into the Arctic regions and the Antarctic region to be able to actually change what's happening in terms of reflection of the light from the sun, and to use technologies that they have developed to actually make a cooling of what's happening at the Arctic. And there's ocean fertilization. All these technologies are somewhat available to us, but they need to be funded. And some of them have a longer range advantages. So some of the carbon removal technologies, the hybrid solutions that are involved, actually can sequester carbons for hundreds of years, so that we're actually extracting the carbon from the atmosphere and then being able to put that back into the ground, back into building materials, into roadways, into the types of infrastructure needs that the developing world needs to be able to address some of the climate change issues, some of the issues surrounding poverty, some of the issues that are surrounding the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. So we're addressing poverty, we're addressing inequality, we can address education, we can address supporting the improvement of what's happening on the earth with the cleansing of the water, with the cleaning of the air. All these different goals that have been set up that can be addressed now have a mechanism that can make it financially viable for the investment to be brought forth and actually make these innovations available to be implemented in the developing world. And I'd like to be able to turn it over now. I think that we've been working with Arno Neumann, who has some other perspectives because he's been involved in some of these efforts to bring funding into the world.
Thank you very much, Mark. So thinking in terms of the solutions of implementing the technologies to deal with the climate crisis, there's a parallel that occurred in the late 70s when we were dealing with the population crisis. And the world was looking at food insecurity. And they basically needed to develop technologies to increase the amount of food to match the increase in the population. And that was actually done. It was known as the Green Revolution, and it was significantly hubbed in India. There was a Dr. Borlaug who developed the technique and technology to be able to increase the food output from grains. But that all doesn't come in a vacuum. It takes knowledge, it takes technologies, and it takes capital. And behind the scenes is that we hear that there's a lot of capital going toward green projects. But within the world of finance, there's a key issue that the financial world is looking for, or several key issues, and they're looking for returns on their investments, and they're also looking for returns of their investments. And when they examine where they're going to put their capital, they're always looking at risk and risk mitigation. So in terms of an appetite to doing these things, it's there. In terms of how to do these things, keeping in mind the risk and the risk mitigation, that's where the rubber meets the road, from another event that Marshall brought up. The rubber meets the road when we go knocking on the doors for this capital to implement these solutions for the climate crisis in this case versus the population crisis. So what I've been doing is working with this issue of blended finance, where you work with high net worth individuals, you work with family office, you work with large financial institutions. And in each case, there's an education that has to come about. First of all, what is it that you're trying to address? What technologies are you using to address them? And how do we fit in? And how do we mitigate our risk? This is where the pre-issuance credit enhancement guarantee is a very key instrument and methodology to be able to convince the people that their capital is mitigated, the risk to their capital is mitigated. It is a process. This is what I'm encountering is the novelty of approaching, realizing and attracting large amounts of capital to these solutions, because at the back, you always have to answer the question, what's in it for me? What's the returns? But how risky is this to me? Been talking to both large institutional banks, high net worth individuals, and divisions of the World Bank. And most of these issues involving adoption are all the same, whichever ones we're addressing. So I'm in the process, very confident that we will be able to get people to blend together. Syndication of capital is one of the ways that people do mitigate the risk. They say, well, I don't want to do it all, but who else is on board? And we're turning the corner, and I believe that we'll be able to extract the capital that we're required to implement these technologies.
Thank you, Arno. At this point, if we could go to the next slide, Sharif. So as Mark had mentioned, there's a connection between what Arno's just talking about practically in terms of blended finance, of bringing it all together, but at the same time, the connection between the sustainability development goals and the ultimate mechanism that also addresses the adoption issue and risk. So one of the beauties of the climate bonds are that they're highly regulated. They're very strict. They're the only green bonds that are monitored by Fitch, Morningstar, and others. And that's because they're bonds that when they say you're going to do X, Y, and Z, you must do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, there are significant consequences. With the other green bonds, there are no consequences. In fact, we have examples of that we've talked about on previous sessions. But here we're talking about where we need to go and what the solutions are practically. So I think Mark spoke to this same slide at the last session, but this is a little different take on it. In the short term, the climate bonds are strict rules that ensure projects that meet the SDG requirements and offer climate change solutions. That's really significant. All of these 17 goals or sustainable development goals are connected to the climate. Not one of them is not unrelated. Even poverty, it's all related. We know that when there's a massive change in the climate, like I said before, there's going to be a prediction of 200 million climate migrants. That's going to lead to poverty. That's going to lead to confusion and chaos and political chaos. So we need to address this in the short term, but we also need to look at the midterm and the long term. And in this regard, one of the mechanisms that we know that we're proposing for Malaysia, together with the World Talent Economic Forum, in supporting its efforts, are aligned with our efforts, is what David Smith calls the 3 Ps. That's public-private partnerships. So, David, I would like to turn it over to you a little bit for your comments on how the blended finance and the public-private partnerships would benefit one another.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marshall. Public-private partnerships are a unique creature that tries to leverage the best of each of the different verticals, from the private industry, the public industry, and really pull together ways to look at innovative ways to finance projects that not only can be completed, but have sustainability. And that's one of the reasons why a public-private partnership is powerful, as opposed to just a contract or a joint venture that have more finite life cycles and have a lot less transparency. One of the hallmarks of public-private partnerships is actually the transparency that comes with the instruments that are used to enable it and have it working. The type of projects that you put in, particularly as you look at climate bonds, are ones where it has a fairly significant impact in the country, the region, the infrastructure that's being implemented in. And it's very important to get the type of stakeholder involvement from each of the sectors that you tend to do in public-private partnerships, because you have the stakeholders come together in a way that address this as in my view, of climate activity as grand challenges, because this is something that's necessary for the future sustainability of the region and of the globe. So that is one of the big elements of it, is working it. And this slide is actually good, because if you look at the short term, midterm, and long term, looking through there, you can see various stages in each of them where the nuances of the public-private partnership will change. One of the examples I used is how in the United States we build many of the toll roads, which have a finance portion, often from outside the United States, that comes in and then works with the state, the contractors, academia, and others to produce those projects. And you're going to have the same type of thing as we look at the climate bonds to do this. You're going to have that type of interaction. And this is just proven to be a way to be able to move faster, which is necessary with climate change, and to be able to bring adequate resources, not only near term, but long term, to support the sustainability of the project. The biggest failure I've seen globally when I've looked at infrastructure projects like these to help change a country, change a region, is they get built and then there's no money to operate it. It gets built and they did not upgrade the education systems to have people there who could work in it and sustain it. That once the flurry of the bill goes away, many of those projects die and the money's wasted. And that's why one of the other reasons you see public-private partnerships being successful when you tackle this type of projects. But Marshall, I hope that kind of hits the overview that you wanted me to.
Excellent. It's a classic approach to adoption of innovation. Thank you, David.
I wonder if because I'd like to bring David Kelly into the conversation, because it seems to me that with the various points that Marshall's made, that Arnold has made, that I've made, and that David Smith has made, that there's a lot of complexity, and that if I understand what you're doing, David Kelly, is actually having the capability of being able to coordinate all these various factors, which seem extremely complex when you're talking about global solutions, and when you're talking about public-private partnerships, and when you're talking about something that is at the level of an infrastructure lift with all these complexities.
Well, yes. I mean, that's the point of the governance systems we're talking about, is to remove the complexity, and and a lot of ways it's about not just removing complexity, but removing bias. And a lot of times when you have groups working on projects like this, you have some kind of negative dynamics around groupthink and just interpersonal relationships with playing politics and things that are just part of human nature that we're able to extract in a collective system, because people aren't always interacting with themselves. The system is abstracting that complexity, but also abstracting some of that, the normal elements of human nature that kind of make management of these larger projects complicated. And that's why we're seeing adoption in some of the countries that we've been talking to, for not just developing policy, but actually managing policy and managing these political organizations with e-governance systems.
Is there some sort of I guess, managing organization that goes over that, or is this something that is actually the fluidity of it is self-directed, or is there?
It's self-directed. I mean, the system itself can actually hold a conversation with you as well as a person. It's that sophisticated, and it manages itself. That's the whole one of the big points of the system is you might go into a corporation and you could replace the CEO or put the CEO on par with other executives. So it's no longer one person in charge, but the system is in charge. The people are in charge, by providing their input to the system, where the system actually is making those decisions based on the collective will of the constituents in question.
And so what drives that will? What is the driving force behind that?
Well, it's literally the will of the people or the constituents. It's where we're applying that it's a cognitive architecture that is essentially thinking in a very similar way. The system itself is actually thinking in a similar way to a person, except
Well,
for
last time I remember that you mentioned the democratization of information and the sharing of information. So in this type of a project, because what we're looking at is bringing these blended financing solutions into these major projects. And so how would you configure that aspect of it, where one nation is going to try to keep certain information privileged, and so you don't necessarily, how does that work?
inside the context of the system, it would be very difficult to hide details from constituents that are using the system. You know, it's designed to be very transparent internally. So if I like take a partnership, you know, that consists of constituents that are part of the government, part of the private sector, and they're all part of this system, and the system is managing some project or partnership or whatever it is. Within that context, by design, nothing is hidden from anyone within that system, at least in terms of, you know, the accounting, the bookkeeping, the data, all of that stuff is fairly transparent. Now, you could isolate it. So there is functionality in the system. Like you might say you're doing a policy related to some environmental problem in a local region. Maybe it's a port or something, and you might associate that with a certain level of expertise. None of that stuff is hidden, but the system won't make a decision until enough experts in the field actually touch it. So and that's an example of where you have the system, isolate a certain part of your experts within your constituency to make it so they contribute, but it's not that you're hiding anything from anyone else. Now, that being said, you do also have this concept of certifying decisions on a blockchain and making some of these other kinds of functionality that can be exposed or not exposed, and you can make the same decisions with other parts of the system to people outside the partnership. But that's up to implementation details. By design, the issue is transparency internal to the project or the organization or the constituency that's being managed.
So this would seem to me that in terms of being able to bring an innovation into the marketplace, you're looking at, because obviously investors are very concerned about mitigating their risk. And this sort of technology would really be able to secure a lot of the risks that otherwise might be felt amongst the investors. And obviously, if you're dealing with public-private partnerships, the governments, they're dealing with those kind of policy issues, and the private sector dealing with the investment side and the actual implementation of the project.
Yeah. That's actually the kind of stuff that, with the country in question is I don't know if it's a third world country, but it's not a European or North American country, and they are looking at using the system in a number of different areas, including managing public-private partnerships in tourism, shipping, trade management. They have a free zone they're working on, and in actual governmental politics, and they're looking at a system that can be implemented across the board in all of these different sections. We actually have a prototype system running in our lab that we ran some just basic questions for their prime minister through the system, and it's just basic questions, and you're getting these huge 13-page analysis of just the data before you're even hooking up all the constituents to be able to provide input and further analysis and additional experts. As right now we're using a pretty limited pool of experts for these kind of demonstration processing, and everyone seems really excited about the fact that we really are able to work around some of the more traditional problems in managing projects like this.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
I think, David, I think that one of the things that from listening to what you're saying, it hopefully this is something that could prevent, like the movie that I just saw, which is Don't Look Up, if you've seen that movie.
Oh gosh, yes, I have.
Which was on one hand it was humorous, but on the other hand it was an allegory to the extinction of the world, which is what's being predicted by the other tools that are out there. There's a climate clock in New York City that's counting down as we speak right now. And we have less than 7 years before we get to the point of no return, just on greenhouse gas emissions, let alone what's going on with the Thwaites Glacier that's affecting countries like Indonesia and in the Southern Hemisphere, and losing ground to their cities with the increase of water on the earth. So one of the things that I think that you bring to the table, along with the rest of our team here, is that the development of the approval of an adoption is based upon information that is gathered from the data. That's what your system is doing. And you're doing it in a very cognitive method that can take in a lot of data in a short period of time and hopefully get to those kind of results that allow people to get to the right decision-making process and the right investments. So in today's session, what we're talking about is what is the keystone, as Mark pointed out, on that bridge that allows us to be able to cross the chasm so that the countries can not only adopt your technology, but the other climate-saving technologies that were on our slide deck that can be implemented to actually change the outcome of the climate crisis. And everybody's talking about that we need to get to a 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature on the Earth and by a certain date. Some countries have made commitments to 2040, 2050, even 2070. That's too little too late. So what do we do in a situation, and this is a discussion for the group, and we're now at this discussion point. So my first question for the group is, what needs to happen for people to adopt the keystone of the credit enhancement? If you think about it, credit enhancement is the pre-issuance credit enhancement allows people to look at a mechanism where if they've been pre-approved by the Climate Bond Initiative, saying that they have the goods to be able to deliver, but they don't have the funding to do it, that they have the technology to manufacture and the manufacturing capacity to do it, and the deployment capability, and they have the mechanisms that follow the rules of the road. How do we get people in both the policy sector of the governments, such as the government of Malaysia? How do we get them to adopt this credit enhancement where the risk is almost zero to them? I mean, they're setting aside money that they get from other people, like GFANs, which is private investment money. They set it aside into their own bank accounts. They issue a credit rating, and they allow the climate bonds to be issued and funded through the Luxembourg Green Exchange, as an example. And who invests in the Luxembourg Green Exchange? It's not the government of Malaysia that I know of, or the government of India. The people that are funding it are first world investment groups, pension funds, high net worth individuals, huge companies like Alphabet and Google and Meta. Those companies are investing those kind of monies. Some of the monies that they're trying to invest in are what called carbon credits. But that's a problem that we'll address maybe in the next session, because carbon credits are just the front end of something that is much greater, and that is actually reducing the carbon in, as Mark pointed out, in the atmosphere. So the question I pose to the panel, and everybody can chip in, is what needs to happen from your point of view to create adoption of the pre-issuance credit enhancement that will allow the entities that have the technology, such as yours, David, and ours, that to get funded properly and get adopted and get deployed as soon as possible. Now, we all know that certain technologies, such as yours, have to go through these prototyping capabilities, and it's like getting a medicine to the market. You just don't issue the medicine and because people's lives are at stake. Well, the same thing here. People's policies and issues and lives are at stake. We have technology on their hand that's been around for 80 years. We've just repurposed it, and we have other capabilities. So the question is, what does everybody think it's going to take to get the policymakers to actually adopt a pre-issuance credit enhancement guarantee so that they can get their economy to meet, and their countries to meet, the 17 Sustainability Development Goals? I'll start off with David Kelly.
Well, honestly, in terms of getting people to adopt things, I leave that to other people. I could tell people how to implement physically in a system or adopt within an organization, but it's really other experts that have got to handle the part of getting people to actually buy in. That's outside my box.
Okay, so David Smith, you're muted. There you go.
Buying in to technology is always a multifaceted project. One of the things I love to do is use a rope analogy. oftentimes leaders, when they're trying to get the buy-in, they treat it like a rope, and they try to push the rope to the rest of the people who are involved. And I don't know about you, but I have found I can't push a rope very far. It doesn't work very well. So what you end up needing to do is you need to create pull on the rope, pull on the issue, on the implementation and the approach that you're trying to do. And there's many, many, many different ways to do that. And many of the projects have their own unique twist to it. But one of the biggest things you need to do is, like I said, instead of doing it as a top down and pushing the rope, you need to create pull at all the different levels in the project to have it be successful. Again, hundreds of techniques, and you mix and match them to what works with your various stakeholders and what their care abouts are.
Thank you, David. I think that's a great observation. Arno, do you concur, and do you have any practical experience?
I concur, and what I see is it's not one party that's going to do it. It's a group of party, and it's about getting comfort level. Stepping forward, once one has done it, that develops a great sense of comfort. So how to get people to actually adopt something and take the comfort at this point in time is the magic, and we're working on that. I just think that there's flexibility in the framework. I'm sensing that with various people. They're saying, I'm really interested, but I need to fit it into this box. And the ones that are going to adopt it are the ones that are flexible.
I agree with you, Arno. And I think one of the things, before I pass it off to Mark and go back to Sharif, one of the things that we've experienced in adoption of both technology and policies over the past 30 years with our group is that adoption of innovation is targeted like anything else. So you have to identify the attributes of what we call the innovators in that space and the early adopters. And that's what we've been doing for the past 30 years for different things. We did it for the iGen 3 for Xerox. We did it for Kodak. We did it for a lot of different companies on technology side. We did it for the state of New York for certain policy decisions. So one of the things that we have found is, and this is where I think, David, your technology could be very helpful, is that you need to identify the attributes of the innovators, then the early adopters. And the way it works, it looks like a standard T distribution curve. And what happens is on the left-hand side, there's very few of them. And in a conservative environment, it's even fewer. But like a normal distribution curve has tails on either end that are almost identical. But we have a little bit of shift right now to the right, so there's even less. But there are people out there and decision makers out there in governments that have the need to be able to bring capital to the table. One of the innovators in this regard is Sean Kidd, who is the chairman of the Climate Bond Initiative, who was given the task by Angela Merkel, who, by the way, his background is a physicist and a scientist, to create a plan to use climate bonds. And you can look it up. There's over 100 trillion euro in climate bonds that are going to be issued over the next few years to accelerate the adoption. So the question is, what's the mechanism to get people that have technology that is viable, such as yours, David, but needs to be funded at an infrastructure level, like as Arno pointed out, building roads and bridges, or Mark did, or David did. So we are at a stage where we need to build for countries infrastructure level capabilities to handle their waste, which is overwhelming them. It's creating water pollution, it's creating air pollution, and it's creating health concerns. Many children in developing worlds have asthma, and it's coming from in India. They are burning rice husks at a rate that is unbelievable. You can't walk in the street without having a mask on, and even then it's overwhelming at certain times of the year. So we need to address this rapidly, and quickly. So one of the adoption issues that needs to occur is this keystone, which Mark presented. And Mark, just what do you think is going to take to get that keystone adopted, which is the pre-issuance credit enhancement?
Well, I think David really spoke to it pretty directly when he talked about the fact. Arno spoke to it very directly when he spoke about education. And it is a process of educating the people who are in the positions to make those kinds of decisions. So information is really key. And because we're dealing with already something that is an innovation in terms of financing, the whole notion of blended financing and the credit pre-issuance credit enhancement is a new idea that is not familiar to a lot of the people in the investment community. So in educating them and being able to give them enough validation about it, because what we're targeting, and this really goes to what you were saying, Marshall, which is that we're looking at the adoption curve and we're looking to find who are the innovators who are willing to be the first on board, the first ones to adopt this kind of technology, this kind of investment opportunity, to be able to fund the kinds of technologies that advanced resilient technology brings to the table, to be able to do carbon sequestration in a hybrid manner, to take David J. Kelly's technology and to be able to use that to actually manage these types of massive undertakings where you're dealing with a wide variety of people involved in the management of them, and being able to bring that to the table so that those first people on board will do it. Once you get the first innovators, the very first people to begin to adopt it, and others see the success of it, there is that backlog of that 100+ trillion euros that's waiting to be invested in these projects. What it needs is that person, that individual, that organization, that bank, that could be a sovereign bank or a government that looks and sees, here's an opportunity to turn around what's happening with our country, with our environment, with our locale. How do we actually mitigate the climate crisis? How do we cross that bridge so that we can actually solve some of these problems? That really becomes the key issue. And so in order to do this, it really is a process of education, of getting the people to know what the options are and that they're available and that they can be taken advantage of today, not tomorrow, but right now.
Yeah, Mark, I think that's a good point. And the concept of education is another element, another important factor in this. This is why we support the World Talent Economic Forum. What Sharif has done, Sharif has brought together a series, before we were involved, he's brought together a series of educational capabilities that needs to get out there and needs to be used, and he does use it successfully, to create messages such as the forum we're on today. So I first of all, I want to thank Sharif for giving us this opportunity to continue the series that on addressing the challenge of the climate crisis, and bringing with the kind of messages and mission that we're trying to accomplish. Sharif, one of the things that I think that you're able to do in a very successful manner is to communicate to people in different parts of the world, such as the government of Malaysia, such as India, such as Bangladesh, and other third world entities. I know that you're helping to fund sub-Saharan African entities, such as the 100 women in Rwanda. Those are all SDGs, and they're all tied eventually to the climate crisis. And so, Sharif, we want to thank you for having us on this program today. And thank you for allowing us to at least begin to get the message out so that it can be adopted. The bridge to this credit enhancement can get out there. And if people have questions about this and want to know practicality, we can share that with you. One thing I learned about Arno has been able to do it successfully in certain regards. And it's called FOMO, fear of missing out. Once somebody does it, that in the adoption curve is probably one of the key elements to be able to get other people to adopt. And we can discuss that with key element and key players that you introduced us to, Sharif, and that we meet through these sessions. So again, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for being a participant in this program. Thank you again.
Thank you everyone. Actually, one important aspects when I discuss about World Talent Economy Forums, everybody discuss in the modern world discuss about investment, what you are doing right now. Yes, definitely this is very important, and they discuss about technology. But most of the people they do not care about the grassroots level people, the developing nations peoples. We want to care about these things. Example, today I discussed with around 40 different grassroots level people. I asked them what is sustainable development goal. 80% people they do not know. 90% people they do not know. I'm sorry, this is the reality. So until or unless whatever you are inventing as a technology, the climate change bond, this that, it will not be successful. We need to educate people. We need to create awareness to the people. So when people are aware about this uh, sustainable development goal, then these are the things, and they take action, then this kind of initiative will be successful. That's why I am talking about people. World Talent Economy Forum more focus on people. Trust me, even in Malaysia, 70 to 80% people they do not know what is SDG. So we need more dialogue like that. We need to engage with the people. We need to help the people. And when people can understand and they're motivated, then all of your practical initiative will be successful. So that is the objective of World Talent Economy Forum. We are more focused on people. We are very much focused with this people initiative, and our organization is not my organization, it's a people organization. All of you, those who joined today, this is your organizations. So we have to work together. We have to work hard. I know that there are many people in the grassroots level, uh, and they are good people. They deserve more. So your contributions, your projects, your technology, your innovations can change millions of people's life. But I request everyone, as all of you are global leaders, someone scientist, somewhat corporate persons, please engage with the people as much as possible. Otherwise, all of our dialogues and initiative will not be successful. I believe that when I understand that 90% people, even in Malaysia, they understand what is SDG, then it's successful. So hopefully I will do my best, but alone I cannot. I need all of your support. And I want to give special thanks because continuously you are joining in World Talent Economy Forums. And next year, February, we have one of the largest like conference and summit in India, and we already working with prime minister office, the banks, corporations, academies, scientists, even we want to bring all of the peoples from World Economy Forum. We are working, we are collaborating with them because they have many social entrepreneurs like you. So there are many positive people around the world, but if we connect all of the positive people together, hopefully it will be life changing. So thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. But remember, people number one. We always have to support the peoples, and we have to engage with grassroots level people. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
Bye bye, Sharif.
Bye-bye,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
But
Thank you.
Thank you.